Madam Chair, I'd like to call up amendment number 50 as modified. The revolution in hydrofracking, and particularly in the production of natural gas, has been enormously beneficial to this country, both in terms of energy costs, electricity costs, environmental benefits, and this amendment is designed simply to ensure that we don't inadvertently lose those benefits through unencumbered exports. Currently, the Department of Energy has 48 BCF a day of applications for exports, and in fact, the total production in the United States is 78 BCF. So, almost 60. We have applications for almost 60% of the current capacity in the United States. So, this amendment is really very simple. It's co-sponsored by Senator Stabenow and Senator Franken, and it would simply require that the Department of Energy do an economic study of the effect of additional exports above those that are already been approved before issuing the national interest determination. That the economic study determine what will be the effect upon domestic prices and domestic supply and regional effects, as in addition to the macroeconomic effects that are also already taken into consideration. I just don't want to lose the tremendous benefit and advantage that the explosion of natural gas has. I guess that's an inartful phrase, isn't it? The vast expansion of natural gas in this country has brought to us and risk it by not at least understanding the consequences of additional exports. This would not apply to exports to free trade agreement countries, and it would not include proposals for exports that have already been approved. So this would be on a future basis, and is simply requiring an economic study so we understand the consequences before additional exports are approved. Again, the idea being to preserve the tremendous advantage that this natural gas development has brought to our country, to our consumers, and particularly to our manufacturers, and not see it lost through exports, which could, as we know from around the world, could significantly increase domestic prices unless we keep an eye on that ball. So that's the purpose of the amendment. I offer it and hope that we can adopt it.
Senator Manchin. Oh, Manchin. You're next to Senator Manchin. Senator Heinrich, excuse me.
Thank you. Madam Chair, originally I had some real misgivings with this amendment because it linked, it sort of lumped in free trade nations as well. But I think I appreciate the work that Senator King has given in sort of scaling this back to where the study should be, which is as we export, we should study the increments that we export. I think that's a reasonable approach. I strongly support exports of natural gas, but we should do that in increments that we understand and with great certainty in the process. So I think this is a reasonable amendment.
Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I appreciate Senator King's leadership on this. I'm proud to join him and Senator Franken, and I appreciate Senator Heinrich's comments because I think often in this debate there has been interpretation that those of us who want to do this in a thoughtful way in terms of making sure we keep our edge on American manufacturing and address consumer price issues and so on are against exports. And that really is not the case. What we have in the Department of Energy are studies that vary widely. And so we have, as part of a two-part study, Department of Energy requested in 2012, one report issued by the EIA found that gas exports, quote, will lead to higher domestic natural gas prices and that consumers would pay more on both their natural gas and electric bills. And then on the other side, we had a different study. NERA Consulting concluded exports would have negligible impacts on prices. So it's all over the board. And given that, I think it highlights how complex this issue is. and the multiple variables involved in the factors as it relates to cost and benefits. So from my perspective, while on the one hand, there's no denying that we have technological breakthroughs that have unlocked previously unthinkable gas resources in this country, that at the same time, this is a huge economic benefit. It's an edge for us. We're bringing jobs back. We're bringing companies back because of lower gas prices. And so before or as we go ahead, it's just, I think, important to be able to be monitoring this and make sure that, because we know that the whole situation in terms of the markets has flipped in recent years. Within the last decade, we've seen companies invest billions in LNG import terminals. Then the market changed. Those closed down. Now we're doing export facilities and a push more for that. So this is a very volatile situation. And I would just say it's our job to make sure that in the end, since this is such a critical resource and a great new opportunity for us in jobs, and all the numbers show 8 times more jobs come from using this for manufacturing than on export, that we do this in a thoughtful, measured way. And I think that the King Amendment really addresses that. So thank you.
Senator Russell.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to speak in opposition to the King Amendment, and with my great friend from Maine. I believe that this amendment is, if adopted, would severely degrade the bipartisan support that this legislation currently enjoys. You and Ranking Member Cantwell included the LNG export provisions because you recognize the importance of timely permitting decisions. We have a broad bipartisan coalition of Republicans and Democrats who support the bill's LNG provisions as written, and I think that this would, as written, would grind the LNG permitting process to a halt if the King Amendment was adopted. So I don't think there's actually a need for the King Amendment or some of the other amendments that and I see Senator Warren is here. The Department of Energy has already conducted a number of studies on LNG exports. In each one of the studies, and I can get all the studies for you, the administration has found that natural gas prices will remain low. So I appreciate the concern of Senator King and others. LNG exports aren't the source of New England's energy problems. It's interesting. It seems to me a refusal to cite natural gas pipelines in that area of the country. There was a grid of prices of natural gas depending on location, all on the East Coast, whether Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, up to Maine, and the prices jump all over the place based not on the availability of natural gas production, but on the ability of having pipelines to take and transmit natural gas to that specific endpoint location. So I think it's a refusal to cite the natural gas pipelines that are the bigger problem. And many of us would like the energy bill to ensure timely permitting decisions for natural gas. So I'd strongly oppose the amendment.
Madam Chair.
Senator Franken.
Well, the Energy Information Agency disagrees with Senator Barrasso, and I think what we're talking about here is fairness to the taxpayer and to the American people. Every time we talk about the explosion in natural gas, as the senator from Maine called it, I try to remind the committee about what a large role the U.S. taxpayer played in this, in terms of making fracking possible and doing the research that made it possible in New Mexico, where Senator Heinrich's state, the Sandia National Labs, did 3-dimensional microseismic fracturing, which makes this imaging, which makes this possible. And the Energy Information Agency said that, and Senator Stabenow said that there are variances in these estimates, but we should really be cognizant of, if we are going to do an unlimited export of LNG, we are going to drive up the cost of natural gas in this country, and we are going to be subsidizing manufacturing in China. So if that's what you want to do, if you want to make natural gas less expensive in other countries and more expensive here, then you should vote against this, because you're saying, well, I don't care. Whatever happens, happens. All this is asking for is that we keep tabs on what the price, on what this is doing to the price. That's all we're asking. And Minnesota produces no natural gas, but we do a lot of manufacturing. We just had a taconite plant lose 400 jobs. And one of the things that they're talking about is partly has to do with steel dumping, but part of it has to do with the cost of the energy to fire the pellets that are made out of the taconite pellets. And so this is serious to our manufacturing base. And if one of the things we enjoy because of fracking is a lower price, but we want to keep that in place in the United States and do this in a balanced way. And I know that, for example, the senator from New Mexico, Senator Heinrich, they produce natural gas there, but he's been very, very supportive of doing exports, but doing it in a balanced way. And I believe that this amendment is just basically saying, let's do this in a balanced way. Let's make sure that we're being fair to the manufacturing states, and that we're being fair to the American taxpayer.
Madam Chair,
Senator King.
I would just respond to the senator from Wyoming. This has nothing. This would in no way abrogate or override the 45-day provision that's in the law. There's no intention to slow anything down. There's simply an intention to have information. I don't understand a position that says we don't want information. Yeah. And for every new increment, it's true that the studies thus far have shown minimal impact. But you don't need to be a PhD in math to realize that as you get closer to higher and higher levels, closer to the capacity of the country, there's a higher likelihood of impact on domestic prices. So all we're looking for is information and not a delay in the process. I'm supporting the 45-day provision. I think this is a reasonable provision that simply protects American consumers and taxpayers just by letting us know what the facts are. That's all the amendment requires.
Madam Chairman,
Senator
I would just say the Department of Energy already has the authority to conduct those studies. They don't lack the authority to do it. And I would also point out to Senator Franken that the National Association of Manufacturers actually supports the LNG provisions that are in this bill. So that's the position of the organization.
Have they taken a position on this amendment?
They've taken a position on the bill, the provisions that are in the bill itself as brought out in a bipartisan way.
I think this amendment doesn't really alter.
Madam Chair?
I would just interject here, call upon myself as a prerogative of the chair. You know, Senator King, when I first read this amendment, I thought, well, okay, we've had multiple studies, as has been pointed out, and the studies that have come forward, whether it's at Brookings or Deloitte, have reached that consensus that you have cited to, that these exports are good, everything's working along this way. And while the amendment, I think, sounds reasonable, I think the concern that Senator Barrasso is speaking to is the potential here for politicizing studies, so you get to a point where you're using the study to cause delay. And I think that's one of the concerns that I have had. We saw it was the NERA report back in 12. It was delayed nearly 6 months. Nobody was really sure why, but there was an election in the way, and that report was done in the summer. It was released, and it was released unedited in December of that same year. So you have to admit that there are some red flags that are thrown on that. I'm also concerned that the discussion that we've had here so far has been about we need to understand this based on the impact of pricing. And clearly pricing is an issue. It's something that we all pay attention to, and we should. Senator Stabenow has also mentioned the manufacturing aspect of it. But I think that there are also other considerations that I think we recognize bring benefit to the discussion, and that is the geopolitical implications of our exports and what we're able to do there. So I am concerned about the amendment that you have presented, and really question why we need to do it. I will note that Senator Warren has an amendment on her LNG exports study. I'm hopeful that that's one that we might be able to agree to, and I don't know whether the two of you have had any discussions on this, but perhaps that then gains the information that you are seeking, Senator King. You know, I don't know, Senator Warren, if you want to speak to your amendment. We're not in that point now, but yours takes us along the same lines, but not so far as Senator King's.
That's right. So mine is also just an amendment to study the economic impact of LNG exports and focuses on the impact it will have in different regions of the country. We know that not all regions will be affected the same way by the exports, and so it requires the Department of Energy to do this study and to look at it region by region. Actually, I say it region by region, state by state, region by region, and the national implications to pull it all together. The amendment would not do anything to slow down the process, as Senator King says about his amendment. It does not alter any of the language in the base bill, but it does say we get a study, we get information. We want to know how we're going to be affected in the Northeast. People in the Midwest who have a lot of manufacturing want to know how they're going to be affected, and that's all we're asking for here. That's what my amendment is about. Excuse me.
Senator Cantwell.
Well, Madam Chair, I know that this is going to be an issue that we continue to talk about, you know, in this committee, and I'm sure on the floor. And I certainly support Senator King's amendment. I think that my colleagues from the Midwest have talked about how important it is to focus on manufacturing, and again, coming from a hydro state where cheap electricity has built our economy over and over and over and over and over again, I am just a huge fan of affordable energy pricing because it will be what makes us competitive in the future. So I think that I also support the language that's in the underlying bill. I think the language that we have crafted in the underlying bill gets us to a point where we are talking about permit process. And so I don't think that it's different from where the Department of Energy is today. I think Senator King's amendment is about the future. I don't know if Council can refer to that, of exactly if we passed both of those things together, what would happen. I think Senator King's information would come back to us in the future. Is that correct?
If I may.
My amendment would only apply to future applications, not ones that have already been approved, and it would not, and the 45-day requirement would remain in place. So it would have no effect on the timing of the Department of Energy's consideration.
I think that one thing that we all need to think about is that the 1992 law, as it relates to free trade agreements and where we're going to be with free trade agreements, which I've been a supporter of opening trade agreements, I think is a different process. So I think that Senator King's language could be helpful in that discussion. So whether we have all of that now today or when we go to the floor, I just think at some point in time, I think, you know, thinking about those ramifications and how Senator King's language would apply would be helpful to us. But I know we'll have two amendments here to vote on. And
Madam Chair. Well, Madam Chair, I first would support both of the amendments that have been put forward, but I think what we have is an interesting situation where folks coming from different perspectives are suspicious of each other. And so you have an amendment process set up to move along something that, frankly, the Assistant Secretary of Fossil Fuel Energy, when he testified in January, basically said, we really don't even need to put in place. They are within their final determination comes within days of when FERC completes its licensing action. They've reformed their process. They're doing it. So you could argue that that my friend from Wyoming's proposal isn't even needed because they're moving forward. On the other hand, you could say, well, this isn't needed in terms of the study and information. I would suggest that what this is a balance that addresses the concerns on both sides. You want to make sure the process moves. We want to make sure that while it's moving, there is adequate information so that we can judge down the road the impacts on our economy and on consumers. So I find it a very interesting situation where you could argue neither of these are needed or both of them are needed. But I would suggest that as we move forward, if we want to move forward together, it would make sense to allow both of these things to come together. So thank you.
Madam Chair. The energy market can change very rapidly, whether it be the oil market or the liquid natural gas market. So when the Department of Energy makes its decision with regard to liquid natural gas that exports would be in the national interest, it's very important that they use up-to-date current data. My understanding is that they are relying right now on a report, the NERA report. There are other studies that they can rely upon, but I think officially what they're looking at is a 2011 NERA study. And so clearly with a rapidly ever-changing marketplace for these energy items, products, that it behooves us to make sure that the DOE is using the most up-to-date study, and they're not doing that right now. So we want to make sure that when we make these predictions about whether or not the export of this particular item is in the national interest, making a bad guess would be not what we want to foster. So I do support this amendment.